Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are gathered today to listen to Professor Sabrina Al-Kire. She heads up the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at Oxford University. Well, I'm afraid her reputation precedes her as a scholar and academic. She has done extensive work on poverty and the measurement of poverty and, of course, of human welfare in various different forms and in very interesting forms more recently, I think. She will talk about multidimensional poverty and particularly for policy. So it's doubly exciting on the one hand, the more tackle the more theoretical aspects, but also the tackle the huge leap that one has to take after that to bring that to the hands of policymakers in a way that they can use it. So with those words, I wish to hand the meeting to Mustafiz, my co-chair today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan Hafiz Bhai. Good afternoon. I would like to join Dr. Hafiz Bhai in welcoming Professor Al-Kire to our discussion today. And on behalf of the audience gathered here, let me express my deep gratitude for taking this trouble. We know that there was some, you were supposed to come day before yesterday, but because of the flight and everything, but in spite of that, you have been so kind to come to Bangladesh. And I would like to recall that when Professor Rehman Subhan first heard that you will be coming to Bhutan, he was very keen to have you with us, and Hafiz Bhai and CPD, and we thought that it will be an excellent opportunity for us to listen to you, to learn from you. As Hafiz Bhai said, you're coming to Dhaka and your familiarity with your name, it really precedes your visit to Dhaka. So many of us will be knowing the Al-Kire Foster Index, the multidimensional poverty index that you have developed. So we will be very happy to listen to what you will be talking to us, particularly for the Bangladeshi audience. I think in the context of the SDGs, the multidimensional aspects, the social, economic and environmental aspects of development are becoming very important. And how do we triangulate this is a challenging task. And as Hafiz Bhai has said, to take it to the policymakers is even challenging. So from that perspective, obviously it will be very educating for us. And we know that when you did your DPhil, you have done the work on operationalizing Professor Amartya Sen's capability ideas, and from then on you have worked very closely with your collaborators in terms of developing comprehensive indexes and in capturing the multidimensionality of poverty. So from the SDG perspectives, I think it will be very important and it will have important implications for the policymakers as well, because SDGs talk about this multidimensionality of poverty, and it also talks about no one to be left behind. So how do you develop an index where we can capture all these complexities? So from that perspective, it will be very important. And we also know that you are coming from Bhutan, where the gross national happiness index is being developed, and you have also been associated with that. So we'll be very much looking forward to your ideas in that respect as well. So once again, on behalf of the BIGD and CPD, and on behalf of our Bangladeshi audience, we would like to register our deep appreciation for your presence today. And also in the audience, we have economists, policymakers, we have experts, we have development practitioners, so it's a very diverse range of audience, but with a common aspiration to learn from you about an issue which brings us together. So with those few words, and once again thanking you, I would like to request you to present your ideas to us, and then we can have a discussion if you are okay with that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely grateful to CPD and BIGD for the opportunity to be here. And my aspiration is to learn from you, because I think that Bangladesh has a lot to teach. And as a student of Amartoda, also he's observed how effective, in a sense, the social policies have been in Bangladesh. And our own work that I will share here also shows a strong success in reducing multidimensional poverty. And so my hope is that in this interchange I will also learn more from you, not only about the measurement side, but also about the policies that may be driving these changes. And it's also a big delight to be here because of Professor Rahman Soban, and my admiration for him has no limit. So what I will do in the next half hour or so is just first of all, for those of you who might not be so familiar, briefly review a little bit of the motivation and mechanisms of multidimensional poverty measurement, but in a completely non-technical way. And then show you some of the results using a very crude measure of multidimensional poverty, but one that's available for many countries. And show you, in a sense, also Bangladesh's performance from 2004 onwards, according to that measure. But then, because many governments now are wanting a policy tool that is more personalized to their context, to their data sets, to their national plan or their constitution, I'll also share with you, in a sense, some of the ways in which governments now are developing official national statistics of multidimensional poverty that sit alongside their official national statistics of income poverty, and how they are using these for policies. And close by introducing you to a network now having more than 40 countries, soon it will be more than 50, that are exploring or using or designing official national multidimensional poverty measures. As perhaps a community that would be very interested to learn more from Bangladesh. So first of all, the motivation for measurement is not to create the best number. The motivation has to go beyond that. It's to create a simple metric of poverty that's a little bit less inaccurate than other measures of poverty. And I think we begin from the reality that poverty has many different faces. And in the book that we have recently published with OUP, which is full text online, there's no cost to look at it, we open with a quote from Victor Hugo from Les Miserables, in which Bossuet describes his life as living under a roof of falling tiles. And what he means by that is that there will be health catastrophes, financial needs, tragedies of friends, housing crises. He doesn't know exactly when each will strike, but he knows that he is quite vulnerable to all of them. And it's this reality of the interconnected, interlocked aspects of poverty which comes up a great deal from many of the participatory work, many of the more in-depth qualitative studies of poverty. And yet until this time, our metrics have tended to focus on the monetary aspects, partly because that is what we are able to measure, partly because of the convention within economics, and partly because economists have not been able to use, in a sense, dirty data, categorical or ordinal data on water supply, on sanitation, on binary data like access to electricity. We haven't been able to use this in a rigorous, mathematically rigorous way. Hopefully, we are now learning to do so. So in a sense, the motivation also draws from Amartya Sen's conceptual framework of the capability approach, in which he recognizes that human lives are battered and diminished in many kinds of ways. And so an adequate measure of poverty must similarly try in some way to reflect the overlapping disadvantages that people have. This quote was right before he wrote the paper with Sudhir Anand on multidimensional poverty in 1997, but the insight is reiterated in the 2013 book India and Uncertain Glory and many other places. Finally, the motivation at present is amplified in the Sustainable Development Goals. Not only do they have ending poverty everywhere as the first goal, but they explicitly recognize that poverty has many forms. The second sentence of the preamble of the document approved at the UN General Assembly aims to eradicate poverty in all its forms and dimensions as the greatest global challenge. So there's a priority given to poverty, and we didn't know when the Sustainable Development Goals were negotiated whether poverty would be there so prominently. Many feared that it would be subsumed under environmental concerns. Also within the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 1.1 concerns extreme income poverty, but Target 1.2 again focuses on poverty in all its dimensions. I'm on the Interagency Expert Working Group, and the indicators that are being negotiated for 1.2 include the MPI. So in a sense, that is the framework, the ethical framework from Poor People's Experiences, a conceptual framework from Capability Approach, and in a sense more a political framework from the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are also important efficiency arguments. For example, this roadmap was a 50-country study in which UNDP looked at the countries that had made the most progress in reducing the MDG, non-monetary indicators. And they found that the fastest progress had been made by governments that addressed several dimensions at the same time. Child mortality together with water and sanitation and mother's education, for example, because these are interlocked. And it actually was more cost effective to address them together. And so there may also be cost savings in taking more of an integrated or multi-sectoral approach. And for that reason, the SDGs also focus on integrated policies and breaking the sectoral silos. And there's also, in a sense, a Rawlsian, or a preference for leaving no one behind, as was mentioned in the introduction. And that requires really being able to disaggregate your poverty measures within countries by different groups. So we need an axiom, a measure that can be decomposed by different groups. And finally, in a sense, the Millennium Development Goals were already multidimensional. They had 8 goals, they had different indicators, they had different aspects of poverty, but they had no summary measure, no headline measure that stood alongside the income poverty measure. Even malnutrition, which was in the first MDG, was so often overlooked. People said we're succeeding in MDG 1, and they simply meant the monetary measure. The Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, which reported to President Sarkozy on how best to measure the progress of societies, reflected that although they did not propose a single summary measure, that there's value in having it. And there's value not only because, as Mahbub al-Haq said, for the Human Development Index, we need something as crude as a GDP per capita, but better. But there's also a recognition that having a single summary measure makes explicit some value judgments, some priorities that otherwise are never clarified. And I'm happy to discuss that further. So in a sense, these are the motivations, ethical, political, conceptual, and also in terms of efficiency and communication of trying to measure poverty in a multidimensional way that also brings it to a single number. Now, when we do that, in a sense, there are 2 basic roads to take. One is to do a measure that can be compared across countries, and the other is to do a measure that cannot be compared, but is much more appropriate for each individual context. In income poverty, we have both. The World Bank reports the $1.90 a day for 118 developing countries. We report the global MPI for 117 developing countries. So these measures are formally parallel in that you can compare Tunisia to South Africa to Bangladesh to Afghanistan. And in a sense, the same framework is being applied. But every government actually uses its own national income or consumption poverty measure. Very few governments use the World Bank measure. And so in a similar way, many governments are developing national multidimensional measures that better reflect the context and content of poverty and their own priorities in addressing it. So I will give an example of the global MPI to take you through the methodology and some of the interpretation of the index, then share Bangladesh results, and then go briefly through some policy examples. The global MPI was launched in 2010 by UNDP, supported by our group, and we continue to estimate it every year. We'll release the updates, which include Bangladesh 2014, on the 6th of June. It has 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standard, that are equally weighted, and 10 indicators. So you are deprived if anybody in your household is malnourished. You're deprived if a child has died in the last 5 years. You're deprived if nobody in your household has completed 5 years of schooling, or if a child is not attending school up to the age at which it would complete class 8. You're deprived if you don't have clean cooking fuel. You cook with wood, dung, or charcoal. If you don't have improved sanitation by MDG definitions, or safe drinking water, electricity, safe flooring, or more than one of the following assets: a radio, television, telephone, bicycle, motorcycle, or refrigerator. So that's a structure. But what actually happens, like for any poverty measure, is we begin with each person and household, and we look at their lives and see which of these different indicators they are deprived in at the same time. So these hands belong to Buba, a 72-year-old farmer in the district of Chukha in Bhutan. She is not deprived in flooring. She has very good flooring. She is deprived in roof, but roof is not covered by the global MPI. She is not deprived in assets. She has plenty. But she is deprived in cooking fuel, as is everybody in her village. Everybody cooks with wood. There is no electricity. It's a 4-hour walk if you walk very fast from the road. So there's no LPG or other fuels. Her granddaughter is the only child in the village not to attend school at 12 years of age. So they are deprived in school attendance. And nobody in their household has been to school, in fact. So she's deprived in a number of the different indicators. However, I must say always that a measure like the global MPI, but really any measure, is inadequate, and it leaves a lot out. She was very hospitable. She was very happy, very serene, very welcoming, and had a great sense of humor. And so a metric really only shares a small part of her life. And it's important always to recognize that and be self-critical about what you can actually say from a measure. But how do we use the information that we do have? So for Puba, in terms of the 10 indicators, she is deprived in the ones that are coded dark. And so we add them up with their weights, and across them, she's deprived in 2/3 of the dimensions, 67%. So first of all, we ask whether or not she is poor. It could be that she hasn't completed schooling, but she's a self-made billionaire. So it doesn't matter. It could be she doesn't have electricity, but has all the energy needs covered through other means. So one deprivation may not signify poverty. In the case of the global MPI, a person must be deprived in at least 1/3 of the dimensions to be identified as poor. So Puba is poor by that criterion because she's deprived in 2/3. So the first aspect of the MPI is the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived in 1/3 or more of the indicators. The second aspect of the MPI is something we call intensity, and that's the average percentage of deprivations poor people experience at once. In Puba's case, it's 67%. Across all the poor people in Bhutan, it was more like 45%. When we multiply these two together, we get the MPI, and that's using a methodology I had the privilege to generate with James Foster. It has very many axiomatic principles. It's very much like the income poverty gap measure, but it is also simple. It only requires multiplication. So that is the methodology in a very simple way. I have a director of communications at OFITA that doesn't let me put equations on slides. We do fight about this, but so there are no equations here. So now let me show you a few of the results that come out when we report that. First of all, we can look across countries. So the global MPI last year was done for 101 countries, 5.2 billion people, and across them 30% of people, or 1.6 billion people, were multidimensionally poor. That's using the percentage of people identified as poor because they're deprived in 1/3 or more of the indicators. And then we can look at them according to the percentage of people who are poor, which ranges from 0 or 1% up to 91%. And we can also then see about intensity, which is on the vertical axis. And we see that in the low poverty countries, each poor person was on average deprived in 35 or 40 or 45% of the indicators. But in the poorest country, each poor person was deprived in 60%, 65% of the indicators at the same time. So the MPI both makes visible the greater extent of poverty in poor countries, and it also gives policymakers an incentive to reduce the intensity of poverty, even if they don't lift people out of poverty. MPI will go down if intensity goes down. So very briefly, when we have this kind of statistic, we can compare it, for example, to $1.90 poverty a day, represented by the black dots, and see the differences. And indeed, there are quite strong differences. We could talk about more between income poverty and multidimensional poverty in many countries, though they tend to agree in the low poverty regions, but not necessarily in the others. We can also look by large national regions where we find the highest percentage of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, but the largest number of MPI poor people in South Asia. That's partly driven by India, and India have not updated their NFHS, as we know, since 2005-06. So India's data are bloated, perhaps. We are also very interested in where poor people live in terms of income status. And just like in income poverty, most of the MPI poor people live in middle-income countries. And this is certainly captured by many of those who are rethinking how donor assistance should be offered. But then one of the priorities of the SDGs is to go beyond national data and disaggregate by subnational regions, by gender, by age, by ethnicity, by caste. And all of these disaggregations are done and available on our website. For example, here is Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Indonesia disaggregated by the different subnational regions. This can be used for geographic targeting. It also can be used to look at how people are poor. So we have disaggregated data for many different countries, and this cannot be done with the income poverty measures because they can't go subnationally. Because of the difficulties in price adjustments. But the final step that in a sense brings a multidimensional poverty measure towards a policy tool, a tool for governance, is the fact that after we have identified the level of poverty, we can look at the composition of poverty and see how people are poor, what percentage of people are poor and deprived in each of the 10 indicators, and how these change across different regions. And this is what gets quite exciting if you happen to be the governor of one of these states or districts, because then you know exactly how the face of poverty looks in your district, and also when change happens, you know who can take credit for it. So this has become quite an interesting tool that I'll show you in a moment. And disaggregation can also be interesting to identify polarizations. So for example, in Benin, these are the different ethnic groups in that West African country. And the pool are the poorest. This is the level of MPI. And so the poorest, the next poor, and so on. And on the vertical axis is the reduction of poverty. It's a race to the bottom to zero poverty. And so the fastest progress was made by these countries. But these are not the poorest. In fact, we look at the pool and we see they didn't change. They didn't reduce poverty at all. So what's happening is between ethnic groups in Bhutan, or in Benin, there's a polarization. And it's this increase in horizontal inequality that's a precursor to conflict and political tensions. And so it's quite important to be able to diagnose these kinds of emerging political or ethnic tensions before they fully are realized and try to address them. And we can see other much happier examples like Kenya, where the poorest group, the Somali, reduced poverty the most. If you're interested in looking at age and looking at other disaggregations, we do have them available online. So briefly, I'd now like to show you a little bit about the changes over time, again using the crude global MPI, but to give you an idea in a sense of how it can move towards being an instrument for national policy if the indicators really reflected the National Development Plan or other political priorities. So at a glance, in 2004, two-thirds of people in Bangladesh were poor according to the global MPI. And by 2011, it was 49.6%, so just under half. So there had been quite a large reduction in the headcount ratio, and also, as you can see, a vertical reduction in the intensity of poverty. Here are all the numbers, but here it is on the region in South Asia. So across South Asia, Nepal had the fastest reduction, but that's partly because Nepal's baseline was the year of the peace agreement in 2006, which was a very difficult time for Nepal. Bangladesh has had the next biggest reduction, followed by India. And of course, we can then decompose, and with the DHS, we decompose into division level. And so in 2011, Sylhet was the poorest region, and Khulna was the least poor, with Dhaka being here. But it wasn't always that way. So if we go back to 2004, we see this configuration, and we see how Sylhet really reduced from 76% of poverty to just over 60% of poverty. So really quite strong reductions in the poorest region. In fact, Sylhet had the biggest reduction of poverty of all of the regions of Bangladesh, which is a very pro-poor policy. I won't go through the tables. So we've done these kinds of studies initially over 30 countries. Now we've done it over 60 countries. And we'll release the 60 country study later this year. But in terms of highlights of Bangladesh, there was a statistically significant reduction of MPI in every subnational region between 2007 and 2011. And also Sylhet reduced poverty the most in that time period. So it was among the leading countries in these two regards. And as I mentioned, in 2 weeks, we'll update this analysis to 2014. Finally, and this is where, again, the policy interest rises, we can see what indicator reduced. So what this shows is the percentage of people who got rid of one of these deprivations each year. So this is annualized, so we can look across the different time periods in a similar way. So we see, for example, in between 2004 and 2007, the biggest reductions in the indicators were in sanitation in many of the regions. Sylhet had a very strong decrease in children being out of school. Khulna had a strong decrease in nutrition. Barisal in child mortality. So the patterns of MPI reduction were really quite different across the different divisions of Bangladesh in that 3-year period. And there wasn't much change in water, but deprivations in water are quite low in some of the regions, so they were not significantly different than zero. But when we change this to look at 2007 to 2011, again the patterns shift quite a lot. And now the biggest reduction is in deprivations in electricity, for example, and also in sanitation, yet again. So this is what moves an MPI, which is one headline indicator, into being a policy tool, because you can break it apart by the incidence of poverty and the intensity, or by all of the different indicators, and in a sense, try to reduce them together. And the last piece of this is just, we obviously always analyze the extent of reduction of MPI and of income poverty. And Bangladesh was one of the countries that had a stronger reduction in multidimensional poverty than in income poverty, both by $1.25 a day depicted here, and by $1.90 a day, which we'll release in a fortnight. The 2012-13 district level MPI, I should just mention, is based on the MIX survey, which is not comparable with the DHS. And in particular, it always, across many countries, gives lower levels of MPI. So we will release the DHS data in 2014. It will be a little bit higher than this. We'll release it in a fortnight, but that's because it's a different survey instrument. But what you see is, regardless of the measure, MPI levels are lower than income poverty levels by $1.90 a day, and lower than, obviously, $3.10 a day poverty levels. So it's an interesting context, because in most countries, multidimensional levels are higher than income poverty. So Bangladesh, again, is doing well in comparison with other countries with similar levels of monetary poverty. So as you see, most of these countries, the black dot reflecting income poverty is below the level of MPI, which is the colored bars. But in Bangladesh here, MPI is below the income poverty. So it's a positive outlier in multidimensional sense. The other interesting thing about Bangladesh is there's quite a range between the different districts, from Dhaka to Bandarban, the poorest district, which has more than 70% of people poor. There's a greater range, for example, in Nigeria, where Lagos has 4% of people poor, up to 87% of people poor in the regions of Nigeria. So Bangladesh doesn't have the biggest disparity, but it does have quite a range across the different regions. So that's, in a sense, what the MPI is, how you measure it, and then some of the statistics it gives rise to. But now I'd like to move towards national measures. So now, instead of envisioning health, education, and living standards, envisage the indicators that are relevant here in the national plan or in other things. It might include employment. It might include housing of different kinds. It might include different services, or quality of education, or other indicators. So think of the indicators of the MPI as being tailored to this context. And then what the MPI can do is track the changes in those indicators among people who are deprived in several at the same time. So getting rid of the people who are not poor or who have data non-sampling measurement errors. And then compare them across different regions of Bangladesh, look at the changes in the indicators that are relevant here, and then use them for policy purposes. So I'd like to just take the last couple minutes to show you how some of the governments are actually using their national MPIs, each of which have different indicators, to zoom in and understand poverty better and respond in different policy ways. So there are now many countries that use an official multidimensional poverty measure. So a couple points. One is that some of them base their measure on simply expert dialogues or roundtables that include leaders of NGOs and academic institutions alongside ministries. Others use a much more bottom-up participatory approach, and that was seen in El Salvador, where they did a study called Poverty from the Perspective of the Protagonists, a 2-year participatory study identifying the dimensions of poverty and adding to what the government expected to come out of the study, a dimension related to leisure, recreation, public spaces, crime, and violence. One use of the MPI is allocation and checking that the allocation matches the contours of poverty. Costa Rica launched its measure in October, but they felt that their high levels of social expenditure were not having the maximum impact that they could on conditions in Costa Rica, and also that there was a lot of duplication between the different ministries. So these slides are used with permission from the government of Colombia, and the Vice President just yesterday signed a document making official this allocation that I'm showing you. They rebalanced their allocation across the different regions because they found they were spending the most in the least poor regions that also didn't have the most number of poor people. They also rebalanced their allocation across different programs. They found that some of the indicators in their MPI had zero allocation. For example, children that were in the wrong grade for age level. There was no effort in government to retain students at the correct age level and not let them slip behind. Moving now to Colombia. Colombia's MPI has 5 dimensions, and these dimensions were the chapters of its National Development Plan. It has 15 indicators, and the cutoffs for each indicator, like what it means to be out of school, are the targets of its National Development Plan. So there was a hand-in-glove relationship between the MPI and the National Development Plan. It was actually designed under Uribe's government, but launched under President Santos's government at the start of his term and in the 2011 National Development Plan. And these are slides used from the government, and they say that there are 2 major ways that the MPI changed their social policy. One is that they created a new coordinated sector for delivering social policy, which included cash transfers, but also something to look at the victims of the considerable violence from narco-trafficking, the regional targeting of different groups, child poverty benefits, and household benefits that were non-monetary. So they created one ministry, the Department of Social Prosperity, to coordinate all of these, and they used the MPI to monitor the trends. And they also created a roundtable headed by President Santos with each minister, and the ministers cannot send delegates. They have to be present in person 3 times a year. And they look at a red, yellow, green stoplight of the 15 indicators of the MPI. And the indicators that have not changed, that are red, are identified as alerts. And then the government has policies each year that it does to try to change the lagging indicators. So there's a high degree of political commitment. President Santos announced a goal of reducing poverty to 22% by 2014, and they made the goal. Now they have another goal for 2018. But it's been quite a learning program for them, and particularly youth unemployment was sticky for many years, and they were finally able to find programs that addressed youth unemployment. Colombia has also not only involved many parts of government, and if you're interested, there's a video on our website of the ministers of health, education, housing, and employment talking about how they have worked together much more since they've been using the MPI. But it also has quite a permeable relationship with the NGO sector and the business sector. And so they actually have a map in which local authorities, national authorities, NGOs, faith-based, all put their activities together. So that they try to look at what they are doing as a country of people, not just as a government in fighting poverty. For Mexico, I'll just mention two things. Mexico was the first country to announce a national MPI in 2009. And they also, like every other government, map their programs against the indicators to see who has responsibility for reducing which aspect of the MPI. And Mexico has very, very good relationship between the poverty statistics and the state-level governments and municipality-level governments, which have adopted the MPI to an extent that my colleague Gonzalo Hernández Licona, who updates the MPI every 2 years for Mexico, never expected. So now the state governors come to him and talk about their poverty measures and what they can do to reduce them. And they have also used it very actively as a coordinating device, particularly to target the poorest people in their region. I'm coming up to my time, so I will simply leave you with one fact and then introduce you to the network. One observation that we have is that most governments, as I said, have both an income poverty measure and a multidimensional poverty measure. And the question is, what's the relationship between these two communities, people who are income poor and multidimensionally poor? In the case of Bhutan, for example, 12% of people are poor by the national income poverty measure and 12.7 by the national MPI. And so they were about the same. I know the colleagues at the World Bank, we were talking. We imagined that they would be the same people. And then we did the crosstab using the BLSS data. And we both were on the phone again. What's going on? It's different people. So only 3.2% of the people are the same. And now we've done this in every country where we can have data from the same survey. We're actually publishing a special issue on it because the mismatch is very high, whether it's in Chile or China, whether it's in Nepal or Uganda, South Africa or Europe. There's a very strong mismatch between these different definitions of poverty. So we'll be unpacking this more as time goes on. So to close, I just wanted to say that all of the slides I've shown you are not mine as an academic, but they're from the real actors, the governments and partners that are working in their different countries to use it. And they give me permission to tell the story because they also fly around. So my colleague Gonzalo flies to Iran or Algeria sharing his work. Ana Chacon here from Vice President of Costa Rica flies over to many countries to share Costa Rica's work. Bali from South Africa, the head of the Statistician General of South Africa, similarly shares their work using census-based MPI. So this is a network of countries that are learning. None of us have all the answers, but we're trying to learn how to use new metrics and also energize different policies. The network, very embarrassingly, started in Oxford, and Oxford's not a very good place to start a network on poverty. It looks very fancy. But it started with a lecture by Amartya Sen, as well as a talk by President Santos. And the network is also quite active politically. So different member countries run side events at the UN General Assembly. Last year, it was organized by Honduras and Costa Rica, and had 5 heads of states, a message from the UN Secretary General, and 20 ministers. And their role in this forum was to advocate multidimensional poverty in the SDGs, and also to focus not on simply metrics, because there's so many indicators in the SDGs, but in using the metrics to manage change very proactively. And similarly, although there's the political side, my work is technical. So we tend to work with statistics offices, and I'm delighted statistics is here as well. And so we also have events in the UN Statistics Commission, in the Interagency Expert Group on SDG indicators, and in those fora, just with the heads of statistics from different countries sharing their experiences in making and using MPIs. So that's a bit of an introduction. I'd simply close with this quote from Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, again saying that our aim is not to measure poverty perfectly, it's to reduce it, it's to fight it. So to get a crude instrument, but one that perhaps better reflects the experiences and some of the aspects of poverty that are overlooked by income measures, and so that we use both of them together. I'm a big fan of income consumption poverty measures. We need them. but they may not tell the whole story. So hopefully having a sister measure that's multidimensional helps us to bring both sides together. Thank you so much.
I think on behalf of all of our Bangladeshi friends who are present here, I would like to register once again our deep gratitude for this wonderful, I think, presentation and for giving us exposure to this frontier thinking about measurement of poverty. I think there are 4 issues which may be of interest for our audience. One is the theoretical conceptual issues. I think this can be one group. The second will be the measurement of the multidimensional poverty index. I think the third will be how do you contextualize this in the Bangladesh reality, because you have mentioned that one thing is to have cross-country and cross-time comparison, but the countries will have their own specificities and how to capture those. And the fourth, I think, will be the data revolution that we are talking about. How do you generate the information which we will be needing? And my own question with regard to that will be that when you did the district level in the context of Bangladesh, the various dimensions, what were the data that was used? Because the HES data is representative at the division level. So but there will be more question on that also perhaps. So Hafiz bhai, anything to add? Okay, let's open the floor, and could you please introduce and very briefly put the question to Professor Alkire. Yes, please, Mahfuz.
Thank you, sir. My name is Mahfuz Kabir. I'm a senior research fellow at Bangladesh Institute of International and Strategic Studies. Just one thing about the, I think an important thing is missing regarding the indicators. Like, I mean, if you consider the case of climate change and climate-induced disasters, I mean, that there is no indicator, even though it's emerging, and Bangladesh is one of the worst impacted countries in the world, and the other issues, I mean, if you see the literature of the late 1990s, I mean, the issues of minority, the voice, and plurality in perspectives. So these were, I mean, they mentioned in many of the literature. So if you see Sen and Ravalion and others, so these are in fact not mentioned in the indicators. So that is also missing, and the physical exposure to disasters. I mean, if you divide the zones, like, I mean, the southern parts of Bangladesh, I mean, the exposed, and highly exposed to disasters, but they might have the things like, I mean, the improved sanitation or the electricity or something. So that is, I think, some kind of mismatches. And just another thing, I mean,
so the thing is how we select them and how we include them in our programs. A lot of judgment, a lot of evaluation, assessment, and identifying them. So we found that there are so many theories, so many processes. We mostly go with human rights-based approach, and there we see that ensuring all the rights, protecting and fulfilling their rights, from that perspective, poverty could be alleviated. So as Amartya Sen also, from his capability theory, complement the human rights-based approach. So far, I studied. And I think that MPI is a fantastic index, though I mean, you might have the explanations that how it could complement the Human Development Index and other indexes, hunger indexes. So many indexes are there in the world. So you might have answers for that. But my question is that you have 10 indicators, 3 dimensions. I would be really happy if you somehow consider including another dimension, what is we call that human rights perspective. You see, in your first, what is poverty? There, Narayan et al. He is saying that psychological dimensions, that is powerlessness, voicelessness, dependency. So, from human rights perspective, we also cover those aspects. So, that's my request. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Getting more complex, minute by minute. Yes. And Dr. Faisal.
Faisal Ahmed, Bangladesh Bank. Thank you for the presentation. I have a very brief question. How to interpret the MPI poor relative to income poor when you mentioned toward the end of your presentation? In the beginning, Bangladesh looks like an outlier, MPI poor, lower than the income poor. But toward the end, you said there's very little overlap. How to interpret this being an outlier when we take into account for the fact that this is poor? Yeah, thank you.
And we'll have a second round.
Okay, thank you so much. And please also feel free to give comments or answers to each other's questions. Certainly, beginning with Mahfouz, in terms of climate change, it's not included at the moment. We do have different research projects where we are looking at how to include environmental deprivations. We completed one with the government of China. We now have one with University of Cambridge and one with Louvain-la-Neuve. So these are research. But basically, there are three options. One is to find environmental deprivations that strike poor people at the same time as poverty, and where the sampling frames are compatible, and put them in. So, for example, if I have experienced a flood, we can see that perhaps from other sources of data. If it's in the same time period, we can merge the data sources by the GIS codes fuzzed out and include it. The second option is that in addition to experiencing poverty, I'm vulnerable to future deprivations that are climate related. And those are different time frames. And so you can overlay the maps, but you wouldn't put it together into an MPI. You would have an analysis of how the poor are also more vulnerable to other threats. And then the third is that we are struggling with some of the environmental data that yet we cannot bring together because the sampling frames for environmental data are geographic and for MPI are political boundaries. And so we are working quite hard with the satellite data in figuring out, with many others, these big data sources, in how to parse environmental data differently so it is easier to merge. And we need to do that behind a firewall because of the anonymity of the household survey. So we're working with DHS because they fuzz the GIS by 5 miles. And so behind a firewall, can they do the merge for us and give us a clean database? So those are some of our thoughts. It's a big topic, but I think there will be some quite new things, I hope, in the next couple of years at the very latest. And in terms of cooking fuel, point taken. There's for a Bangladeshi MPI, you could not use, you could think CNG was not clean or whatever. Natural gas was not a clean cooking fuel. So you can tailor it at the national level very easily. In terms of Rabayat and ActionAid, the global MPI is very limited by data. So we're data users of the DHS in the mix, and national data sources where governments offer them to us. And they don't have anything, unfortunately, on human rights, powerlessness, empowerment. They don't have employment data in many countries. They don't have violence. So we are very much trying to change, in the SDG context, the content of some of these surveys so that they are more amenable to some of the MPI indicators. And a big priority for us is violence, because it's only a 3-minute module, 8 minutes if you have an incident of violence, 1 minute if you don't. So on average across countries, it tends to be 3 minutes, which is very cheap. So putting that in would greatly, at least, take one step forward. And so there are different processes of renegotiating these international surveys. But I think there's much more latitude, again, for experimentation in national surveys of Bangladesh or of other countries where they might be able to quite easily, or they may already have a relevant module. There's no problem technically. The problem is the data. And for Faisal Ahmed, we are trying to understand the mismatch. It's very significant in Europe. It was a motivation for Europe's move to a multidimensional poverty measure, that even using panel data and looking at the chronically income poor and the chronically materially deprived only in economic deprivations you could buy, like having a vacation, a pair of shoes, a washing machine, a roof that didn't leak. There's a mismatch of 50%. 20% of people across 9 European countries are deprived in income chronically. 20% were materially deprived chronically. Only 10% were deprived in both. And that's with good market penetration. And so there's a puzzle of why these mismatches occur, even in economic indicators, much less the health and the education, the public goods indicators. So now that we've established this in our special issue, that it happens everywhere, the next stage is really to try to unpack it and understand why. And I don't know the answer yet, but I think we do need to understand it, because it's clearly a mismatch. That's confusing to policymakers if they're trying to, for example, choose between a proxy means test or an MPI. So China uses now an MPI for targeting. It doesn't then target the income poor, right? So there are lots of debates in this area, but again, no answers yet.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Sadiq.
I'm Sadiq Ahmed from the Policy Research Institute. Let me first say that this was a fascinating presentation, a great research. I was also a student of Amartya Sen from London School of Economics, so welcome to the same club. I think the idea of multi-dimensional poverty is not new. We all know that, because nobody, even at the World Bank, I was with the World Bank for 30 years, and Martin Revallion and I worked together very closely. We never believed that income poverty, consumption poverty was the only dimension. The issue really is the aggregation, I think, if I may say so. Now, on the multi-dimensional poverty, so I think the way you put it, I really thought was excellent, which is that in addition to income poverty or consumption poverty, we are not going to throw it away, because that's the single most important, well understood, easy to communicate, and a good measure in many respects. But that is not enough. I think everybody agrees to that, and the point you made it very well, that there can also be reversal, because you may make progress, but you may not be able to make progress. Range of issues will come to that, and I'll comment on that dimension of why there might be conflict and etc. I think the important question is, I was just thinking about the weighting system, but that's where always in aggregation there's a problem, because in welfare theory it is, I don't think there is any kind of a model which will tell you what weights to use, because we all know interpersonal utility comparisons, they're absurd. That's what first lesson that Amartya Sen gave us when he was teaching us welfare economics. And as a result, whose weights are these? And what do they reflect? They reflect some kind of a value judgment. But whose judgments are these? Because government may have a different value judgment from you as an individual. So when you are maximizing your welfare, the 18 or 10 dimensions that you showed, you'll be choosing very differently from when the government is maximizing. So that's a problem. And of course, we have to be pragmatic. We can make some choices. My question is, does it make a difference in terms of how you choose the indicator? That's the first set of question. If so, what is the practical way of doing it? Number two is when it comes to policy, because in the end, that's what you want to do. Now, when you have a multidimensional measure of poverty, and obviously these are different, they measure different things, and we all know that budgetary resources are very, very limited and scarce, and government's policy attention, delivery capacity, very limited. How would they choose, and is there a trade-off? Now, if there is a trade-off, and if they choose differently, then they are putting a value judgment there. Now, should that be, the weight that you use, or because, for example, in education, right now there's a debate going on in Bangladesh, and many of us believe that we should be spending a lot more money on education. But they don't have, of course, they should also be spending more on health and sanitation, etc., etc. But we know the government doesn't have the capacity. Also, delivering those other facilities far more difficult than education, because there's a lot of infrastructure there. Now, if the government decides to put priority on education, and there's a big increase in education, but they're not an increase in other things, are you going to say, when you do a weighted average, that poverty has fallen because the government's policies are not on the right track? I think this is a very difficult question of political economy. How do we go about that? Now, related to the other measure that Faisal raised, which is where you see the conflict. Now, I'm just wondering to what extent this could be the choices that people make. Because in Europe, as we know, and in US also, when they define the level of income, minimum income, they take a very much more broader measure than the way we define it here. Because our measure, it barely gives you food to survive. But in Netherlands, for example, they're talking about close to the median, in some sense, because they have a particular definition of poverty, which they want schooling, they have a house, they have And in some sense, they use the multidimensional poverty in the income poverty measure, which we don't do it here. Now, the issue is, if you choose the income based on certain level of consumption of all these things, but then the individuals concerned who have the income choose to use it differently, are you going to say they're poor because they've chosen differently, or are you going to say they're poor because of some value judgment that society is putting? Thank you. Finally, where can we access your the data and the results, please?
Yeah, thank you. Faiz, you want to?
Hi, I'm Fayaz Salukdar. I'm a researcher with CPD. Thank you once again, ma'am, for giving this very enlightening talk. It really provides us with a new broad way of looking and thinking about the underlying issues that plague not only our country, but pretty much more than half the world. My question was related to the discussion which we were having just now. I think correctly people have identified that the choice of indicators determines how we view the relative scores that we get, and that may be driving this mismatch between income, poverty, and MPI deterministic poverty levels. However, over there, I'm a little bit curious to know about how you went about choosing the relative weights of these indices, because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you have 3 dimensions and 10 indicators, but the indicators pertaining to education and health have a greater weight than the standards of living. So if you were to flip the weights, we would get a very different portrait of different country rankings of MPI, and maybe there would be less of a mismatch between the MPI scores and income poverty scores if we change the weights. In addition to that, maybe one would want to consider access to government assistance, because this is data coming from the DHS, so it's household level survey data. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, all DHS modules ask that question if households do receive some form of assistance from the government. The idea being that it's a measure that strongly correlates to income poverty, but may be very heterogeneous with the other indicators that you have here. So you may be in a situation where you're in a country which has very poor nutritional attainment status, but people aren't that poor through income. So maybe not high levels of government assistance, but nutrition is a big issue. But you may be in another country where nutrition's great, income levels are very comparable, but the country is suffering from a very crippling electricity generation problem. Now, because the electricity generation has a relatively lower weight than nutrition, that affects your underlying MPI score. But we may want to think of both problems in a similar manner. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiz. Dr. Salahuddin, you wanted to come? Dr. Salahuddin is our former central bank governor.
I have a few observations, not any questions. This MPI multinational, along with other indicators, definitely will serve a good job for eliminating, reducing poverty. And it's wonderful that you have included some of the indicators which usually miss from different measures of poverty. Having said that, Amartya once said, a very stark or glaring poverty you can see by open eyes. So the main thing is, in fact, which worries me now as former policymaker in the at least monetary policy matters, actually, if you know, then how you do it. The process is very important, process dimension. We know about the poverty, and there are gradations of poverty also among the poor. So that really bothers a lot. I was going through your 10 indicators. I think that basically 2 indicators that we could have really added it, since you have added cooking, assets, and other things. One is access to finance. I think that is very important. Whatever you do, you have to do. And we have been talking about poor people are poor because they are not getting any finance from government, from formal sector, and they're going to the informal sector or a non-formal sector. And second, I think employment could have been there because Michael Lipton and others used to say that employment is a basic right, isn't it? So Professor Yunus tells that credit is a basic right, fundamental right. So both the things. So these are the 2 things which I thought is a little bit missing. Now, having said about the process, poverty has a 2 dimensions, basically state dimension, level of poverty and all that. Also process dimension is very important. Process dimension poverty means that how the poverty is really generated. It is how the tenancy rights are being established, how the wages are being bargained, how the other relational variables are there, which really creates poverty in the future. So unless you really look at it, you cannot have a good process poverty. That is very important. And lastly, microcredit proponents have been advocating two basic indicators, $1 a day, then they've revised it $1.25 a day. And second, what they use is called participatory wealth ranking index. Participatory wealth ranking means they usually go to some area, then ask people who doesn't have a roof, who doesn't have access to water, these things. So it is the people who also participate to identify the poor. That is very important. So that is last, but about the finance still good, because I wrote a paper for ESCA ministerial meeting. They asked me to write a financing development for the poor people. So I went through all these things because there's a high level meeting in Incheon, Korea. They took place. So I was a little bit I should be surprised that you didn't include it. Possibly you have it in the back of mind, but definitely it could have been included within the 10 indicators. That will be more focused. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You'd like to.
Thank you so much, and I'm taking notes also on the comments, which are very, very valuable indeed. First to Dr. Saudi, in terms of the weights are normative, and we disagree with each other about weights. We disagree with ourselves. I disagree with myself about weights. And so following Amartya, then one key is to make the weights transparent so they can be critically scrutinized. And the other is to make any measure that will be used for public policy robust to a set of weights. So if you're going to rank countries by the global MPI, it has to be robust. If you're going to allocate budget according to something of the MPI, then those, however you're using the MPI for policy. And so when we work with governments, we say, how will it be used? And then work back to design the robustness tests. And these are written up informally in our book in Chapter 8. And so it's the composition of poverty, it's the rankings, it's the levels. But just to give an example of the global MPI, the robustness tests we've done there is we weight each dimension 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and each indicator within it equally. So 1/6 if there are two indicators, 1/18. But then let's say we weight education 50% and the others 25, or health 50%, or living standards. So we do robustness tests by adjusting the weights between 25% and 50% on each dimension. And then we look at the overall ranking of countries, and I haven't talked about standard errors, but all of our comparisons use statistical tests, statistical inference. And so strictly 84% of pairwise comparisons with standard errors are strictly preserved under all of these, all weighting scenarios between 20% and 50%. So that's what we've done. We've also done for the poverty cutoff, if it's not 33%, if it's 20%, if it's 40%, 94% of pairwise comparisons are strictly maintained. So that's been our attempt to basically make as transparent as we can the implications of these value judgments. And so if people disagree with them, they know what to do. We thought when we launched the MPI and when governments started to use it, that they would experiment a lot with the weights. In fact, every national government to this day has used this equal weights across dimensions and equal weights within with these robustness tests. And we don't push it. It's up to them. But that's what they've been using so far in the different countries. The other, in terms of how we access the data, everything is available online. So on ofi.org.uk, our website. So the data tables in Excel, a visualization software underlies, so you can do all of the graphics that I put are there. And we want to make the do files, we work in Stata, so we want to make the do files for every country public. There's a version of them on the UNDP website. There's been so much traffic and questions that we don't, at the moment, have the capacity, so we're hoping UNDP will post our Stata files, because every student writes. It's too much work. And the last thing is that you asked about the mismatch. Because yes, Europe uses 50% of the median or 40% of the median as the relative poverty measure, and that's in the studies that I used. But actually, it's interesting because in the papers that we have done, we look at different poverty thresholds it's very unintuitive. I don't understand it, but as we go down to more extreme, the mismatch goes up. So, for example, in South Africa, if it's 30% of people poor, 11%. But if it's 11%, that's why I can remember it. If it's 11% of people that are poor, so more extreme poverty cutoff, there's only 3% overlap. So it rises. And I don't know why, but we need to know why. And in terms of FES, I think I answered a little bit on the robustness. In terms of assistance from government, the reason we didn't use the question, it's not in every DHS, but also we were trying to do a measure where the deprivation was comparable, a malnourished child, a kid out of school. But in the cases of assistance from government, what that means on the ground varies a lot between different countries. And so the extent of that deprivation wasn't comparable. And so for a comparable measure across all these countries, that was booted out by the Statistical Advisory Committee that we were working under. But it could certainly be done at a national level. And at a national level, financial health, microcredit, employment is almost always used nationally. It's just internationally we don't have good data because many women don't say what their spouses do on the DHS. So it's a bit of a mystery.
Thank you. Dr. Mirza Aziz Islam and Dr. Alam afterwards.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm glad that I came because I believe I learned a few things. So I just have a few comments. Incidentally, I'm Azizul Islam from Prague University. We met just before coming into the room. Well, my first question, of course, related to the choice of indicators and weights. Those questions have already been asked and we have answered, so I don't want to pursue that anymore. Now, one of my suggestions is that you might wish to think in terms of follow-up as to the allocation of resources by governments. How is it related to the incidence of your MPI in different countries? In my own experience, I had in 2008, when I was in charge of the Ministry of Finance, I did some quick exercise, and I found that the allocation of government resources per capita was inversely related with the incidence of poverty. I tried to bring about some correction, including some geographical targeting. For example, I gave the highest allocation to PKSF to deal with the Monga problem in our northern parts. So perhaps some sort of follow-up study as to, that would also indicate how committed the governments really are in terms of addressing the poverty in its multiple dimensions. Now, the other question that I wanted to raise is that in your indicators, in some cases, how do you take into account the quality dimension? Take the case of education, okay? Your indicators perhaps would be years of schooling, what is the dropout and things like that. But then how do you take into account the quality? Let me give you two personal examples. The wife of my family driver, she did a master's degree, and she has remained unemployed for the past about 3-4 years. One of my maid's sisters, housemaid sisters, she has done a bachelor's degree, and she has remained unemployed. Now, that may be partly because of the quality, partly because the education is not relevant to the needs of the marketplace, and partly because when you have a situation of large-scale unemployment, jobs may be offered on the basis of connections rather than merit. So how do you deal with issues like that? So you would see that, okay, Bangladesh has performed very well in terms of education indicator. And we have performed very well. Look at the primary school enrollment, secondary school enrollment has also improved considerably, though at tertiary level we are still way behind. But then what happens thereafter? So these are some of the issues that I wanted to raise. And similarly, access to, say, safe drinking water. Now, access to drinking water, when it comes to safety, we have a problem. Because when the tube wells, these hand pump tube wells were first introduced by UNICEF in Bangladesh, it was considered to be a revolutionary improvement in access to safe water. And then we ran into this problem of arsenic contamination. So the quality dimensions, how do you handle them?
Thank you, sir. Senior Secretary, Dr. Samsul Alam, in charge of the planning ministry.
Thank you very much. I thank Dr. Sabina for presenting very succinctly and conceptually so clear and very important measuring dimension of poverty she has presented. But I would bring a new thing to your, for your consideration. As a policy planner, I would incline to, relate things with political economy also, which you may not be very, interested to reply. If I consider political economy of using this kind of MPI, you see, if we use MPI to measure poverty level, certainly it will go up. If we use World Bank, measure or index, it go up quite, quite substantially. So my question is, while and MPI are used, those countries which are using this MPI, many of them are, higher middle income country. While we have 1/4 of population is under poverty line, then political government would be very much, sensitive to the number also, because they would like to play with the poverty number also. So if it goes up using MPI, then they would not be very much, feel encouraged to use this. Well, that does not mean it should not be used or it is not a good one. Methodology, it is not sophisticated one. Nobody would say that. Obviously, this is superior method than consumption income poverty or income poverty, in whichever we measure. So when we will be, reaching the threshold of higher middle income country, our poverty level would be at most 6-7%. So at that time, we may think of refining the estimational method, or one country may think of in that way, let it be within 6, 7 or 8%. The countries who are using this right now, the poverty level would not be more than 10%. So anyway, that's one thing. I mean, it is certainly superior, but political government would not be very much interested to use it straight away. Number two, and there are other measures also, to estimate poverty level. For example, Bangladesh going to collect data or prepare data sets. They call it household information data, where actually they are using proximity test to identify poverty level. So if you could shed some light on what would be the advantage, disadvantage of using poverty means test vis-a-vis this your MPI. With this MPI also, with this 10 indicators you as stated, there is debate also, because you omitted important indicator like days of employment, as Dr. Salehudin actually already said that, and also some of our Bangladesh Bank colleagues also said that you have not considered the climate change impact issues or something like that. So that kind of thing would be there before taking in a final year to use it. So that's my question would be, if we use proximity test to measure poverty level, what would be the difference with this one? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take another one, Dr. Dipankar Roy from the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, and then I will request you to go, and then we'll have the final round. We have others also. Yes. Yeah, we'll bring everyone.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think MPI is basically a non-income dimension. So I think they miss the employment or access to microfinance. But in our HAES, this type of data is available. So you can think of. And another questions relating to Samsul Alam sir, that in our national household database, we are going to applying proxy means test formula for effective targeting of social safety net beneficiaries. So what is the big difference, or how is it different from MPI? So would you please explain? And another thing, being a data man, I can assure you that multiple indicator cluster survey 2012-13, it was district level representative. And HAES 2016, which is being fielded now, it is also district level representative. For the first time, we are going to provide district level estimate, poverty estimates, and another thing, quarterly poverty estimates we are going to provide in next July. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, in terms of quality of schooling, there would be different ways of proceeding. You mentioned that part of the problem is that people who have completed tertiary education don't have employment. And in that case, an adequate measure of MPI for Bangladesh would have to include employment as well. But for example, Pakistan, its national MPI that it will launch next month, uses a PSLM data set. And they do have quality of education. So for children that are going to school, it's the parents' report of how satisfied they are with the quality of school. And for the children that are not going to school, it's why not. They're too far away, the facilities are bad, the teachers are absent, whatever. So there are questions that can be used. They're not perfect. They very much depend on the parents' understanding of what good school quality is. So I'm a little bit nervous about using them, but they're the best we have at the moment. And similarly for arsenic and water, if there's a national MPI for Bangladesh, it would need to look at water quality. And so, again, I can't emphasize too much the need for national MPIs to really have indicators that match the context, because then alone they will be really relevant. And coming to your observations, political economy is very important. And I'm a technical person, but I've learned it's important. So first of all, when you make the database, you basically stack everybody up with the percentage of deprivations they experience. It's like a distribution of income and how much income people have. And for income, you could set a food poverty basket or a basic needs basket, an unmet basic. You have different poverty lines that you can set. And then the similar way for the MPI, we actually compute the MPI for every 1%. Those who are deprived in 1% up to 99%. It's just a loop on stata. And so, for example, the global MPI uses a cutoff of 33%, but we can look at the database and say what would be the percentage of people who are poor if we used 50%, and it'll be lower. We actually report that severe poverty every year, or 70%, and we do maps for the global MPI of what percentage of people are deprived according to different poverty lines. So where this comes in is that in national poverty measures, the head count ratio is very sensitive. The poverty rate is what the media picks up on. But it's quite different. So in Mexico, I was under pressure to increase the percentage of poverty. Mexico wanted 80% poverty. At the moment, they have 46% of their people are poor by their national measure. They're disappointed. So in Latin America, they want to inflate. President Correa was very happy because he now has 35% of people being poor. Michelle Bachelet in Chile now has 20%. She wanted 40% of her population to be poor. So there's a different culture, and they feel that they are much poorer. In Tunisia and North Africa, they want it to be very low. So the case that might be most relevant is Bhutan. So what Bhutan wanted was they wanted to match the percentage of people who are income poor and multidimensionally poor. And so long as at the starting phase of doing a measure, you set the poverty line. So long as you keep that poverty line fixed over time, it measures trends. So when we did the first MPI in Bhutan, 26% of people were income poor, 26% of people were MPI poor. They kept the poverty line fixed over time, and actually poverty's gone down very well in Bhutan. But the good news for the MPI is we do these robustness tests to the poverty line. And whereas income poverty, it's very sensitive because of the shape of the distribution. For MPI, it's not very sensitive. So actually, I'm very relaxed. So governments can set whatever poverty line they want, so long as they keep it fixed over time. Then the trends across time are relevant. And so that's in a sense how it's working. And Bangladesh is not, like Senegal is a least developed country. They're maybe 6 months away from announcing their MPI. There's about 12 countries in Africa that are the poor countries that are doing MPIs. So it's not only middle income countries, but it started very much so, as you pointed out, with Latin America. And the other questions that came up was proxy means test. So what happens with a proxy means test is that you have a survey that has income or consumption data. And then the survey also has like health or employment or housing indicators. And so you do a regression, and you look at the regression coefficients. And then you go to your census data that doesn't have income, but it has these associates, and you apply the coefficients to them to predict income. Now, proxy means tests are famous. There's a big literature on it, and I could share in that they have a 30 to 40% error margin, errors of omission, exclusion, and inclusion. And so it's been that debate where MPI entered. And we didn't actually enter it, but government of China was one of the early ones, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, even Palestine. So these countries entered because they found that the type 1, type 2 errors were lower. When you actually use the census data for the household, but you created an MPI from it directly. So whether it's South Africa now, or the other countries I named, now they are using MPI directly to target the poor. There's as I mentioned, there's a question is, they're clearly getting people who are multidimensionally poor by doing that. They may not be getting the income poor. But since the errors were so wide with income poverty, in the case of China's village development program, for example, they say the MPI will show our changes, and so they're satisfied with it. But that's the difference. And yeah, I could say more. In terms of the omitted indicators in the global MPI, with HICE in Bangladesh, if you were to do a national MPI, you could have employment, microfinance, other indicators in HICE. And so national data sets are much richer. And so you could design it with the correct indicators here, which will not be the ones for the global MPI. Yeah. Now, and I'm very happy to learn more about HICE. I was sharing earlier that the one weakness of the HICE in most countries is health. So many Latin American countries also use a form of HICE, and now they're adding a health module, like government on Honduras is releasing its MPI without health, but after 1 year, it will add health to it, because HICE tend not to have outcome indicators for health, but they tend to have a much better set of indicators on employment and more the financial indicators.
Thank you. We have
One
another
thing,
round.
one thing, health
Okay.
module was there. Earlier round in HAES, we had health module, but this time we covered out-of-pocket expenditure.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Then Akash, I'll bring you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. It was very useful, particularly for the non-technical person like us.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Monisha. I'm working with Oxfam as I lead the policy advocacy campaign and research issues there. My question is to have some clarity on how you have addressed the regional, within country, the regional disparity or intra-household level discussion, like whether it's a male or female, because within a family there might be variation. and like the age group, it seems that the child was very focused. What about the elderly? So whether there is any available information or analysis which can be used, this is one. And the second point is understanding a bit more, because you have started your presentation with mentioning about the SDGs. So these data seems to me the indicators are much relevant with the MDGs, but the inequality and the other new dimensions, how it can be reflected or utilized from this available data or analysis, or whether there is any plan to reformulate to address the next generation challenges. And third point is how we can get connected as a practitioner community, because we have probably enough data to analyze the problem, but we actually are looking forward to have some solutions and how it can be dealt, whether there is any data that if we do this kind of model, then we can reduce the inequality because we are having growth. So that would be very useful, and we are happy to join with this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Akash. Dr. Mahbubul Muqaddam Akash is professor at the Department of Economics in Dhaka University.
Thank you for introducing me. I think all these debates originated from the World Bank report of 2000 on poverty. And Ravi Kanbur was initially given the duty to do it, and he left it with dismay. And Martin Ravelian came out with some compromise solution. He suggests, basically the point is, I think poverty is a relative term. You can never define it in absolute term with a single cutoff line. It will differ from, the cutoff line itself will differ from country to country. Even in the same country over time, with the development of average income, the cutoff line will have to be raised. So whenever you fix up a single cutoff line in any dimension, this is going to be outdated today or tomorrow and meaningless. And that's why I think Ravelian came up with the suggestion that each country should has its own poverty line in a relative term, and he defined it as 1/3 of the per capita income of that country. If you have only single dimension, even for a single dimension, you have to first determine the cutoff line. And how do you determine it? This is one of the things, and I am asking you, how have you determined all the 10 indicators cutoff line? This is one question. And secondly, another point is important is how do you choose the dimension? You think owning one radio or less is very important, but somebody who is not eager to listen to radio, he will give zero value to it. So who is really entitled to choose those dimensions? Kanbur came up with the idea that we should ask the poor people themselves, and they should say which dimensions to be included. And I think 60,000 voices were recorded, and if you generalize from them, then you can come up with some ideas about which dimensions are important, which dimensions are most important, like that. And I think we can now agree that food is the most important dimension. But after food, psychological dimensions or material dimensions, that will be very important. And in Kanbur's idea, he put peace as the second most important. But how do you measure peace? So I leave here. Thank you.
Thank you, Akash. Tawfiq?
Thank you. An excellent presentation, and I always thought to...
Tawfiq is with CPD.
Yes, I'm working at CPD. I think couple of my questions are already answered. One was on wealth, weight, and the other one is that this is basically a poverty measure that can be measured at the personal level. So intra-household poverty can be measured. So when you are calculating the weights, this is how do you measure for the children? Because children may be going to school, or children less than 5. How do you measure that? And how do you measure who are elderly? So how do you manage that dimension? This is number one. The second thing is, do you measure if someone is living a same house can have different dimension? Because if someone is sleeping, say for example, with a better floor, someone can sleep with a worse floor within a household as well. So do you have any kind of check and balance for that? So those are the couple of
Thank you,
questions.
Dr. Johnson from the UNDP.
Yeah, I'm Göran Johnson from UNDP. My question relates to the one asked by Oxfam actually about inequalities. How can you capture inequalities by the data you collect for the MPI? I'm thinking not only about inequalities between the poor and the non-poor, but also within the poor as something equivalent to what you have when you measure income poverty, the poverty gap and the poverty gap squared, to see the depth of poverty and the severity of poverty.
Thank you. And last question will be by Dr. Sultan Hafiz Rahman.
Whether it's a question.
Okay, comment.
I think this paradox is really an intriguing one. You call it a paradox. And it's difficult to explain, I think, in the way it's articulated. But this relates to, I think, a question that has already been asked. Exactly what do you think it has to do with the way people tell you about deprivation? You know, because you base it on asking people about deprivation. Typically, a tendency is to, in my experience, which is limited with this kind of cross-section data, but nevertheless, typically a little overstated, but when it comes to income, it is typically understated. But more importantly, people who are income poor may look at their deprivations very differently and not feel so deprived in many ways. So, does it have something to do with the way people actually feel about deprivation and articulate their deprivations? And isn't there a structural problem that actually you can never quite get this right, I think? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you so much. First to Monisha and the others on intra-household. The global MPI takes the household as the unit of analysis, but it's possible to do something else. So Mexico takes the individual as the unit of analysis. So women are poorer than men, and it can break it down by age. I did one for 31 European countries from 2006 to 2012, so 6 periods of data, gender disaggregated, and found that women were never less poor than men in any country of Europe in any period. The closest to parity was Portugal, which was the poorest country. So it's quite interesting, but you can do that at the individual level. However, you still, even in the European survey for income, it's at the aggregate household level. So it's presuming equality of sharing. We did push out a gendered survey through the network, but it was not successful in making it into the proposal of how to change the data collection. We wanted it to be gendered in the SDGs. It hasn't worked. But there's still hope to keep pushing. There were also both Monisha and Kofik asked about child MPI. So I've done a child MPI with the National Statistics Bureau of Bhutan, and children are a disaster because they grow up. And so a 2-year-old, deprivations of a 2-year-old can't include education. The deprivation of a 6-year-old can't include vaccination. By teenage years, you have reproductive issues. And so what you have to make for children is a measure in which the variables have age-specific definitions. What is intellectual stimulation for babies, for toddlers, for early childhood education, primary school? So you have to have graded indicators. And so that's what we did with the mixed survey in Bhutan. There's now a huge interest in UNICEF Central. There's now a global task force on this work. But the nightmare is that babies grow up and getting accurate indicators that are comparable across age cohorts when children mature at different ages. It's very, very error prone for my taste. But we're working on it. In terms of the SDGs, the SDG is in goal 10. The indicators on inequality are not inequality. I'm on the task force for the SDG indicators, and that's the bottom 40%. There's no Gini, there's nothing. World Bank also were quite critical of goal 10 indicators. The MPI will, for example, in future use stunting rather than underweight. Hopefully we'll be able to use violence. And so there will be a process of revising it when the SDG indicators are finalized in July. For Dr. Akash, there's a lot there. In terms of the relative poverty line, there's been a bit of a reality check in Europe. Europe uses a relative poverty line for monetary measures. And so Greece has had some problems, but poverty in Greece has not gone up. Italy, it's the same. So after the financial crisis, people were on the streets. They felt their lives were much worse. Relative poverty was the same because the whole distribution shrank. So Europe now are doing a lot of soul searching to throw out relative poverty measures because actually it's the absolute conditions of people that mean that the measure has legitimacy, and the government statistics offices felt they lost legitimacy by telling Greek that it was no poorer than before, and people knew that their lives were worse off. And so what I heard you saying was, to some extent, perceptual information is important, value judgments of people, and that I would hold on to. But I think that perhaps, at least in income space, a relative poverty measure, which is affected by billionaires losing stocks, is not such a good device for capturing these perceptions. While a poverty measure probably should keep the poverty cutoffs over 10 years, changing them every 10 years with deep consultation for civil society is probably an interesting way forward. And you asked how we set the deprivation cutoffs. For the global MPI, it was based on international standards, undernutrition, body mass index, clean, adequate sanitation. These are the standards that were set. But nationally, every government is doing it differently. And that's where a lot of the action is. And the discussions are, alongside the National Statistics Offices, then they will make measures with different deprivation cutoffs and share them with policymakers to really say, well, what should we use? and what is our aspiration as a country? What do we want people to achieve to be not deprived in each dimension?
Then you cannot have international comparison.
No. For the global MPI you can, but we use
a single cutoff.
Yeah. Then in terms of the other thing I wanted to share was, for example, again with National Statistics Bureaus, I'll give an example from Bhutan. It's on my mind, just came from there. When we were doing the MPI for Bhutan, we did one in the office in Thimphu, and then we went to different communities. So Pubo is in one of the communities. So we had focus group discussion, open-ended. We talked with the GUP, the local leader. We had them identify poor people just like the Voices of the Poor. In the World Bank, Deepa Narayan was in the office next to mine during that study, so I know it up close. Then we had a discussion of what the features of poverty were. They don't use the word poverty, but when in an appropriate way, how they discuss disadvantage. And we got the input. And we also implemented a very short 10-minute questionnaire that reflected what the national government had proposed. And overnight in the farmhouse, we analyzed it. And in the morning, the community came back, and we showed them, according to the measure made in Thimphu, who was poor. They're like, no, this is wrong. And then they told us why we were wrong. And that was the fascinating thing. And you do that 10 times, and you start to get some good feedback. Some of it is very relevant. Some of it, to come back to your point, is I struggle with despair. So there's one beautiful old man, and part of the MPI for Pakistan or for Bhutan is that it has assets like having a cow, and he had a cow. So he wasn't deprived. But he said, but my cow is my friend. My wife died. My cow is very old. She gives no milk. She can't have babies, but she's my friend. And from a measurement perspective, you're never going to capture that. You know, you'll always say, does he have an asset? Not. You know, so there's some crudeness in measurement that you can't avoid. But at least these participatory exercises alongside statistical exercises help us gradually to get closer to a common definition of poverty. And the final point is about peace. My research group do modules on missing dimensions of poverty. And from the Voices of the Poor, we look at shame, humiliation, and isolation. We look at violence, disempowerment, informal work, and unsafe work. So we have modules for measuring them. And I do believe that that will come in. I think the World Bank will release a report, Kaushik Basu, the chief economist, on the 13th of July, saying how they will measure global poverty in future, and it will include discussion of the MPI, and it may propose that the MPI include violence. And that would have huge implications for the survey instruments, but it would resonate much more with Voices of the Poor. And you see it in so many places. You know, like you go to the communities and you're just not safe, so it should be there. Sorry, I'm taking too long. Yes?
My point is that if you think of violence, you also have to think in terms of remedy. So how does the judicial system function? Do the poor people have access to judicial remedy? How costly these are? So these are some of the issues that will come up, you know, once you try to incorporate violence.
Yeah. Very, very briefly, two last points. One for Dr. Johnson. In terms of inequality among the poor, so for each poor person, we have the percentage of deprivations they experience. And so we have a vector, which goes from the poverty cutoff, for example, 33% up to 100%. So from that vector, you can make any inequality measure in the book. Gini, Atkinson, Tile 1, Tile 2. What we do and what UNDP we report in our tables is a variance, which is an absolute inequality measure. And so that's in the tables, and so you can see inequality among the poor. James Foster and I also, our most recent working paper, I'm afraid it's gobbledygook, it's very, very technical, but it basically looks at inequality among the poor. So in terms of the poverty gap, we already have that's intensity. So that's formally equivalent to the poverty gap. So the MPI is a poverty gap measure. But then you can square the gap. And so we looked into the squared gap measure, all of its properties. The inequality measure implicit in it is the squared coefficient of variation, just like the FGT measures. So we have a paper specifying all of that and actually proposing that measure also be reported alongside the MPI. In a sense, what this does normatively is it means if you are really poor, if you're deprived in 90% of these deprivations, you want to give policymakers a huge incentive to reduce your poverty. And a measure that reflects inequality among the poor goes down much faster if policymakers reach these terribly poor people. And so that's the political implication of this approach. And the final observation is, I think what you were speaking about, in a sense, formally would be the non-sampling measurement error. And Angus Deaton thinks that the MPI indicators have a much lower non-sampling measurement error than income and consumption poverty. So he advises us to look into it. It's obviously a very difficult thing to look into. You can only do it qualitatively. But, for example, a malnourished child, you weigh the child. Housing, you can look and see what kind of house it is. You can see if the well is protected or not. So the verifiability of many of the MPI indicators is much higher. And so the latitude for dissension or basically underestimation is a bit lower. And so that's an ongoing topic, but that's why he would feel that the MPI addresses some of the weakness of income poverty measures, which is this systematic bias in reporting.
Thank you. We'll have, yeah.
Would it be, I mean, Europe has very high public assistance for education, health, public goods are fantastic. So wouldn't you have to sort of control for this if you are looking at Europe versus other regions when you are when you are looking at this paradox?
Yeah, unfortunately, Europe, we can't compare Europe because their data, they don't collect these indicators. So it's a big problem with the SDGs that strive to be universal because the data don't exist. So for Europe, we use the EU Silk data, and then now with some national governments in Europe, we're using the national data sets. And they're very different in the health and education indicators. So they can't be compared, unfortunately.
Thank you. We'll have the last round. Yes, Dr. Bash. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi again, and thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I was just thinking that a big impact on how people experience poverty can have social capital, access to social capital. And so specifically in my European country, Czech Republic, it makes a big difference. Only 2 people out of 10 have somebody, or 2 people out of 10 don't have somebody to call in times of crisis. So this, of course, increases people's vulnerability or the ways how they deal with, for example, not having access to healthcare. So I would be just curious how you count with this, or how this was like maybe reflected upon in your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks very much. I'm really very pleased to be able to be in here, and fantastic presentation and discussion all around as well.
So please introduce yourself.
All right. My name is Julfikar Ali. I am mainly from BIDS, but at the moment working at Shiri. Shiri is a extreme poverty program. Okay, I have few points to make. One is about a mismatch between income and multidimensional poverty. Yes, it is the case in Bangladesh as well, and we do have sub-district level poverty maps based on income. Dipankarda is here, BBS with support from World Bank and World Food Program, they prepared that map. If one looks at that map, there are some obvious areas which, I mean, appear as income poorest, but better in other dimensions, other non-income dimensions, education, health, and etc. And vice versa as well. So, for example, Sylhet, income was better, but they are not that good in respect of other indicators, and also in northwest and south as well. So, obviously, that is the case. In your presentation, you did mention about 3% as overlap percentage for in both dimensions. Yes, this is 3%, but I think there is another way of looking at it. It is actually 25%, meaning 25% of income poor is MPI poor and vice versa. So, I mean, if it is 25%, this is not entirely that bad, but if it is, say, that 3%, sounds almost null set kind of situation. So this is my first point. Second is about, since I'm at the moment working in an extreme poverty program, and also a member GAD Shamsul Alam sir is in here. We have just completed the 7th 5-year plan. That we do have extreme poverty as an agenda in here as well, and also in the SDGs as well. I mean, under SDG, there is a dedicated target of actually eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. That is complete elimination of extreme poverty by 2030, alongside, I mean, bringing down the moderate poverty by half or something like that. So, whether do you have any sort of thinking about in this multidimensional space as well, alongside poverty, measurement of extreme poverty in multidimensional space? That is second point. Third is about, which is related
connected to what Akash Bhai asked about, was there any theoretical basis of actually choosing these 10 indicators and also the threshold? And now what is that? Because this is about deprivation, or maybe called about the opposite of people's well-being. So what is the basis of actually choosing this as deprivation or opposite of well-being? And related to this is the relevance issue. The 10 indicators that has been considered is here. For many households, some of the indicators is not relevant. Say for example, mortality, child mortality, school attendance. So for the households where there is no child population, these indicators is not relevant for them. And also for say cooking fuel is important, but probably for countries where a good proportion of people, they do not actually depend on own cooking, probably buy food from restaurants or supermarkets, etc. So this is not probably that much relevant. For flooring, for countries like Bangladesh, I think roof material is more important than probably flooring. So I mean, related to the basis of choosing this and also the relevance is also an issue to be looked into. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
This is Syed Alvin Hassan, Assistant Chief from GED Planning Commission. A question just raised in my mind regarding the measurement of this issue, and when Akash sir from Dhaka University, he pointed out about the rebellions, 1/3 of the average income in the country to be the cutoff point for the poverty. So is it feasible to put the third dimension of standard of living as a expenditure or consumption expenditure, and thinking of it as 1/3 of the average income? If he is not above the line, then he is deprived, if you can measure like that. So whether that is feasible to make some amalgamation between the income and these socio-economic aspects altogether to measure the poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think if there is no burning question, we can have this round, closed, and then Professor Alkire will respond.
Thank you so much. Is it Veronica? Veronica. Yeah, in terms of social capital, there are some governments, Dominican Republic is including it in their MPI, and precisely the kind of questions that you said, if there's somebody to call on in a crisis. Interestingly, I've just been in Bhutan, which is revising their census instrument, and because of the problem of social isolation, particularly in rural areas, they are adding a question on social isolation to the census, which will be very interesting. And it is already present in Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index under the domain of community vitality. So we have been using it in a measurement context, and we also have a series of papers and studies on social isolation, a data set from Chad, which has just come in, and an older data set from Chile with modules on social isolation and shame. So it's important. So if governments want to measure it, always they measure it in well-being, but only sometimes in poverty. I should say that we're working with governments of Ecuador and Bolivia on a form of the Gross National Happiness Index. They call it Vivir Bien, or Buen Vivir in their language, living well. So we're working with them on that kind of well-being measures. In terms of Shiri's questions, point taken on how to report the overlap. In terms of the SDGs, the Atkinson Commission report will look a lot and talk a lot about that goal of eradicating income poverty, because the $1.90 a day don't have error bars. And there are many technical issues because both in multidimensional poverty and in income poverty, the problem is that many people are overlooked. The homeless, those in mental institutions, old people's homes, orphans, all of these are overlooked. And if we want to get poverty to zero, we may need also to revise the sampling frames of some of the surveys. So they'll be looking at some of those issues and really the problems as you get to very low numbers of global poverty. But nobody has proposed putting multidimensional poverty in. They proposed, as you said, by target 1.2, cutting multidimensional poverty by half. Now, initially the UN, and to this day, many institutions want that what is going to be cut by half to be the MPI. And I'm glad to say that if that were applied to Bangladesh from 2004 to 2014, at that trend, Bangladesh would more than cut the MPI by half in 15 years. So the pace of reduction here has been very strong. And it is feasible, we can say, across countries. However, there's others who are interpreting that as being a national measure. And that's more problematic because, as I mentioned, Mexico has 46% of people poor, Bhutan only 12%. Bhutan's much poorer than Mexico. But when you have national measures, trying to cut it by half becomes very messy. So that's one of the issues we will resolve by July in the Interagency Expert Group, is what precisely for multidimensional poverty is going to be cut by half. But it'll be different than the extreme income poverty measure. In terms of the theoretical basis, the global MPI has many of the problems that you said. And we were data constrained. I was told to make a measure for more than 100 countries that was comparable. There's not many indicators that you can use, not many data sets. We could have used vaccination. That was the only other indicator I had for more than 100 countries. So the MPI is data constrained. That's why I keep saying for national measures, you have much more flexibility. For example, Mexico did a new survey, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Turkey, all of these have done new surveys to include their data. Colombia, Ecuador, these use existing surveys so that they could show trends over time in their national MPI when they released it. But I would very much encourage people in Bangladesh to think way beyond the global MPI to the seventh plan and the HICE and the resources that you have, because I think you could do much better. And that leads me to the final issue that you raised about what we call applicable population. So households without kids can't be deprived in school attendance or child mortality if it's a young couple just married. So therefore, they are marked as non-deprived in that indicator. We've done tests, we've published tests on household composition in world development. It's less of a bias than the equivalent scales. If you think of the problem of equivalent scales in income poverty measures, is it per capita? Is there a square root of household size? Is it, a lighter weight for kids under 14? How do you do the equivalent scales? Makes a huge difference to poverty numbers. So we similarly tried to do different ways of applicable populations in the MPI, and the margins of difference are much lower. And so for that reason, we feel any measure that tries to be a population-wide poverty measure will have this challenge. The only way around it is to only focus on people 15 to 18, very specific groups. But that if our margins are lower than income poverty, then in a sense we're playing in the same field. And so finally, Syed's question about living standards, including consumption expenditure, that can be done. So Mexico puts income poverty into its MPI at 50% weight because it was a compromise between a left-wing and a right-wing government when it came out. And Latin America puts income in at 17% weight, so 1/6. So it's certainly possible technically, and it really depends on the political choice. If we come back to political economy, is that there's a history to consumption poverty measures. The media know them, the people know them. And so every government after Mexico has chosen to continue the monetary poverty measures and add a new one. Because it's too confusing to the media to stop an income poverty measure and do something else. And there tends to be a suspicion that the government is hiding something. So it's actually these political economy reasons that have come out. But technically, it's certainly possible.
Thank you, Professor Al-Kire, for the insights that you have shared with us. We are really grateful. On the other hand, you have also, I think, got some flavor of the argumentative Bangladeshis. And I think it was also an exposition of the intellectual richness of our academia, our developmental practitioners. So I think from that perspective also, I think this is very interesting. Of course, as you have rightly mentioned at the end, that whilst this type of multidimensional, index are important, but the national prerogatives and you have mentioned about the prerogative of the 7th five-year plan for Bangladesh, is also very important, because all these have relevance in terms of how we allocate our resources and what are the policy outcomes. So from that perspective, I think it is very important that the national priorities get also reflected. So of course there are a lot of insights that we can draw, but at the same time we have to contextualize also in our own countries, and of course data remains a problem. And generating the data is also something that we will have to look into, so that we have reliable data we are talking about the district level reliability, but we have also talked about household level, intra-household. So it's very complex, in fact. But at the end of the day, obviously, the objective is to let the people have the advantages of development, and that's the main thing for us. So thank you very much, and on behalf of all of you, once again, I would like to give a very warm hand claps to Professor Alkire, and thank you, madam, for your insights, and maybe that our people from our audience will be, after your presentation, they are of course very much enthused to really know more about it. So if they have any question, I would like to request you to get in touch with you, and because these are also of practical significance for our country. So as much of exposure we get to these type of indicators, that will also be helpful for our own understanding of the very complex issue of poverty, which is multidimensional. That's the whole issue. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you, friends. Thank you for your time. Thank you.